Hey everybody, welcome to the next lesson. Today we are going to talk about Adobe After Effects. By now we've kind of explored some various animation softwares, and this tutorial is to kind of introduce you to the basics of the Adobe After Effects interface. So what we will do is we'll kind of hop in and talk a little bit about the interface and how to put files inside of that interface, set basic keyframes to that interface and those files, and then move on to some animation and adjusting of animation within that. So as you can see, I've opened up Adobe After Effects, and I get the menu that pops up with that. And here you can see there's a ton of different tutorials for you to check out and new techniques and whatnot. So if you're super new to this, I highly suggest you look at these. These are great resources from Adobe, and you can kind of go through each one with the next button. For our sake, though, we're going to just simply shut out of this and kind of start with just exploring what this interface consists of. So at this point, I hope most of you are familiar with Adobe Animate and kind of the menu sets in there. I'm assuming most are familiar with Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Premiere. So at this point, there's a lot of similarities between these programs. Now, After Effects can do vector and raster graphics, and it is typically done to create motion graphics for commercials, some compositing work in movies here and there, title sequences, even character animation at certain points. So as we look through this, we have the project window. The project window is essentially our library. You may remember the project window from Premiere, where you would upload images and vectors and Photoshop and Illustrator files you can upload into here. And that's where we kind of store all our assets that we're going to be using within the scene. Below, we have our timeline. On the left side of the timeline is where our layers will be housed when we add them to the timeline. So we'll kind of explore that a little later. On the right side of the timeline, you're going to see where the duration of each layer will be manipulated. Again, if you're familiar with Adobe Premiere, you kind of understand the bars and the sequence duration that occurs with that. This area in the middle is our stage. Our stage is simply called a composition. So in Animate, it's called a scene. And so, if we're doing a new scene, we would just simply do a new composition. We'll discuss that further. Over here to the right, we have all of our kind of menu bars. If you're not seeing the same workspace that I have, please be sure to go to Window and Workspace, and then make sure you're set to default. And if you are, go ahead and it doesn't look right, go ahead and reset your default saved layout. That's a good trick to kind of keep everything in line. All right, well, let's get started. So the first thing we want to do before we even create a composition is add some files to our library so we can use those to create animations. So you can do this a couple different ways. We could go to File, we could go to Import Files, or Control-I. You can see we have a lot of other options. Control-Alt-I will allow us to select multiple files. We can use Adobe Creative Cloud libraries if you choose to, which is a really great resource. We can even import our whole Premiere project. So very, very cool stuff. And so we can go ahead and import it that way. We can go down here into our project library, and we can right-click and go to the import, which is the same options. We can even go down here and we can create folders and create new compositions. So we can kind of add things this way. But my favorite part to do to get files in is I simply double click. And when I double click, I'm going to go to my Adobe AE Assets folder, and I'm going to go ahead and start with this soccer ball. So I highlight the soccer ball. I want to import this as footage, and there's the only option. And right now I'm going to keep Create Composition unchecked. And so you can see we can import PNG sequences. If you did an image sequence from Animate, we could if you had a stop motion animation, it would notice all the numbered frames and allow you to put that in, as well as a Maya animation. But right now we're going to just bring this soccer ball in, and we have a couple other files we're going to play with later. So we're going to go ahead and hit import. We have our soccer ball, which is really nice. It's about 1024 by 1024. It has no background, which is nice. But now we need a stage to put that soccer ball in. So we're going to do this a very basic way. Now, typically, I would do something differently at this point, but being that most of you are beginners, we're going to do this the basic way possible. We're going to click on the big button that says New Composition. You can also go to Composition, New Composition if you get lost. Open this up, and we're going to call this Animation of Ball. All right, we're going to set it to HDTV, 1920 by 1080. We can set it to 24 frames a second here, so just to keep it consistent with the programs we've been using. And we're going to go ahead and make this, I'm going to make it 25 seconds just to be safe. It just gives us a little bit of a buffer room. And then our background is going to be black. But don't worry, that black background is actually quote-unquote transparent, so we can kind of play around with that later on. All right, at that point, you're good to go. We're going to just simply hit OK, and I'm going to use my scroll wheel to scroll in here because my resolution is pretty high on this computer. And now I have my 1920 by 1080. So it's 1920 pixels across by 1080 pixels down, up and down. And you'll see I have a timeline with a pick whip that I can just simply left mouse button and scrub. And you'll notice that I have 24 seconds, or 25 seconds actually, on the screen. Now, if I want to change this, and as I think about this, I think 25 seconds is a long time to wait to preview our animation. So I want to change this composition. So I'm going to go back to composition. I'm going to go to composition settings. And notice that this was 25 seconds. I basically want like 2 frames. So let's go ahead and put this down to something like 2 seconds. And as I do that, you'll notice my timeline gets much shorter. You can see now it's done by frames rather than seconds. I have my time slider over here, in which if I scrub over that with the left mouse button, I can change, or I can click on a specific frame if I see fit. Down at the bottom, I have a zoom in and zoom out function. Always make sure this is zoomed to where you like it. And to the left here, I have a toggle and switch modes. Now, we'll play with that a little later once we get an asset in. We can expand our timeline, and we can show duration. We'll play with that. So let's go ahead and drag the ball onto the stage. That's going to be huge. That's okay. So here's our soccer ball. Now, if I go ahead and hit those buttons at the bottom of the timeline again, and you'll see I get a lot of options. People ask me all the time, why are these buttons down here? Well, these buttons are down here just in case you have a smaller screen on your computer. Right now, I'm working in a Surface Studio, so I have a huge, massive screen. And I can afford this space. But if you have like a laptop, like if you're working on a 13-inch laptop, you want to shut those down. And then you can simply toggle and switch modes to kind of go and find blending options for your layers, parenting options, again, some other cool 3D options that we'll talk about in other lessons. Now, we have our source name. This is just basically a copy of our file that's in our library. And if I want to change that, I can just simply hit return. And the return key will open that up, and I can call this, ball, and we'll do even spacing because we're going to do that ball test, and hit return to end. Now that didn't change the file name. If I actually click on the word layer name, the source is still soccer ball, but it just allows me, in case I want to use, which I will, more soccer balls in this lesson, it will allow me to kind of change that up. Now I want to play with some of the settings because this is way too big. And now the first inclination is to go to the bounding box, like free transform, and maybe hold shift and scale. That's perfectly fine to do. I actually would do it that way. But if I use this little drop down and go and keep dropping them down, you'll see I have functions like position and scale. So if I know I want to make this 25%, which is a pretty good value, I can do that and then simply slide it to the top of my screen. So really easy. You can see anything that's blue, you can actually hold your left mouse button down and drag on, and it will change the value. So if I want to change that position, I can drag. And these are locked right now. Some of them, like the scale, is locked, but the position isn't. And just a fact that I don't think we think about enough is if I put the anchor point, the center of that ball, the origin of that ball, on the top of the screen, you're going to see it's 512 by 512. You're going to see the position is close to 0 as possible, right? So if I actually type 0 and 0 in here, that means that little anchor point's on the corner. If I put it down here, this is where we're going to get the 1920 by 1080. So what this is just kind of telling us, you can see it's very close. What this is telling us is these pixels are assigned like grid points within this animation. So, a lot of people don't realize that when they're thinking of space, and they ask me, well, where do these numbers come from? Well, these numbers are actually what specific pixel that on that grid, and I can kind of play around, and let's see if I can get a grid up here. There we go. what specific pixel on that grid is showing. There we go. So kind of cool stuff. I'm going to keep this ball at the very top, just give it some breathing room. And let's add another ball. So I'm going to add another ball. And it's big again. So instead of using the drop down, I'm going to use one of my hotkeys. I'm going to hit the S key for scale, and you'll see scale pops up. After Effects hotkeys are actually really, really easy. S for scale, P for position, R for rotation. If you hold Shift, you will add, any of the hotkeys. So if I hit Shift P, it will add position to that. And then if I want to see everything, I can just simply open and close that drawer, and they'll all be there. So this soccer ball we're going to put down at the bottom. And let's go ahead and put a color change on this. So let's go to Effects, Color Correction. And we're going to maybe play with the hue and saturation. And I'm going to hit Colorize. And it's a white ball, so this is going to be kind of a lame color. It's just for our sake to get some contrast between the two. And yeah, we'll make it red just so we can see. All right, and I'll play with the color lightness. And again, I'm just dragging on the values. All of these actually I can set animation to. Anything with a little stopwatch next to it, which we'll find out in a few seconds here, you can actually animate the color change. So I'm going to call this ball with ease. And this is a similar demo that we did in animate later. And I'm going to hit return key to get out of that. All right. Now we can animate multiple things at the same time. So I'm going to highlight. This is a marquee, right? I'm going to left click, hold that down, drag over both. And I'm going to hit P for position. You'll see position pops up over both of them. I'm going to make sure my pick, my time slider is set to that 0 keyframe. And I'm going to simply click the stopwatch once. Now you only click it on one of them because they're both selected. That gives us a keyframe, that little diamond. Do you all see that? And now I'm going to drag my cursor to as close to 2 seconds as possible. You're going to see that buffer I mentioned. It's going to kind of not let you go any further. That's okay for this demo. And I'm going to hold Shift, and just to keep everything straight, because if I don't, it kind of gets a little wobbly. And I'm going to pull those over. Now, you're going to notice a lot of things. One, especially with your knowledge of Animate, this tweened our animation. And these dots is a lot like the motion tween in Adobe Animate. We actually even have Bezier handles if we want to get like an animation curve going that we can easily play with. But we've now set 2 keyframes. And I'm going to click away here, and we're going to just play, and I'm going to eyeball off the bottom ball with easing. And we're going to just watch the first ball. So if I hit the space bar, After Effects is going to take a second to process. And when this bar is fully green, it's playing at full speed. You can even go over to preview and kind of take a look here, or info. You can see it says it's playing real time. So that's our animation. Looks okay, right? Some things we can't do in Animate easily that we can do in After Effects is I can actually add motion blur. So now we have a little blur to that ball as it moves. And all I had to do here is click on the 3 little circles. It's an empty box. And when I click it on, it shows up. I love that function. That's so cool. And now one thing I don't have here is onion skinning. I do have the illusion of spacing that I can see these little dots on the screen. I'm going to use my space bar there to use my hand tool. And yeah, it's evenly spaced. And we've done this demo before, and you've noticed that. So what about an uneven space ball? So let's go ahead and eyeball off that and eyeball on our ball. You can see it's currently even spaced. P for position. I can do a few things here. I can simply, once it gets to the middle, and this looks familiar because we've done this before, I can change where it goes. So I'm going to say, okay, I want you to take less or more time to get to the middle. And then once it gets to maybe a quarter of that, I want it to speed up slightly and then slow in to the end. So I'm going to set 2 keyframes. There you go. Now, if we watch both of these together, we have that age-old question of timing and spacing. So what ball reaches the finish line first? Well, they tie. They reach the finish line at the same time. They have the same timing in roughly 2 seconds and unique spacing and clustering of frames. And so I did this the pretty easy way by adding more keyframes. But let's say I don't want to add extraneous keyframes, right? I don't want to add any extra things. So to do that, we actually have a really cool function, and this is something that's kind of in Animate, but it's not like to this point. It's called the graph editor, and the graph editor is right here. So when I click that little graph and I highlight the position, you'll see I have different axes. I have a green line that is denoting my y-axis. Y is up and down, and the reason this is flat is because I have no up and down movement. If I were to go in here and even tweak this at all, you notice how it now has some up and down movement. Now that curve changes. And the way the graph editor works is, this is our keyframe. This is the pixel that it is laying on. And it's telling us what values are registering on the graph over at what time that registering happens. So you can see down here, these keyframes are actually set near the end, and that's where they are on the graph. They're about a little over 1500 pixels. Yep, 1780 to be exact. So if we zoomed in on this graph editor, that would be around 1780 by 918. So kind of a cool thing. But I like to take this a step further. So I like to use these curves to kind of customize my easing. So to do that, and you're going to probably have to watch this part of the video a few times, but you're going to do this with almost everything you animate. You're going to take it, you're going to set initial, extreme, and maybe breakdown keyframes, and then you're going to add easing through curves. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to ball with easing. I'm going to make sure position is highlighted. Now, one thing I don't want to do is highlight both of them. So I'm going to click away. I want to make sure I'm on my move tool. That's my V key, V as in Victor. And ball with easing is selected, and then position. Because otherwise, a lot of people say, well, I can't see the lines and I'm selecting the ball. You have to select the position. All right. Then I want you to find the button at the very bottom of your screen in the graph editor that says XYZ. It's 3 little lines, and it's called separate dimensions. Now what that will do is actually separate the up and down from the side to side. And this is super helpful because what I can now do is, if I look, I don't need up and down animation. So I'm going to uncheck the keyframe, and it turns off that keyframe. What I do need is my X position. Now this curve, I can kind of click on the little keyframes and distribute using a Bezier like we use in Adobe Illustrator. I can distribute the spacing. So what I'm going to do is kind of just really pull this out and exaggerate it, but I want you to watch on the screen in the stage how the dots are clustering. So dependent where I move this, the dots cluster very uniquely. So let's really make it clustered. So now look at the difference. We've not adjusted the timing. We've solely adjusted the spacing. It goes really slow and then boom, speeds up at the end. Really cool stuff. Now, if we wanted to change that, well, we can totally do that. We can take this curve. We could leave it this way and have it go slow in the middle and then really fast. We can take this handle, kind of pull it back to kind of slow it into that parking space, so to speak. And if you're not sure and you don't want to really mess with these right off the bat, there are some presets here at the bottom. So if you grab a keyframe and then hit, like if you want the handle to go right, you can simply hit that and it will kind of split the difference of your curve for you mathematically. This one, I want the handle to go left, so I'll click that button. And it gets a little more advanced. We'll do bouncing ball in After Effects later on. But it's that one with both handles is good when you have like maybe a keyframe in the middle. But now we have some unique spacing. So I'm actually going to pull this spacing out so it looks pretty different than the ball above it. Clustered frames means slow movement. The further apart the dots are, the faster the appearance of the movement is. Remember, we're not adding any timing. We're simply messing with the drawings. I'm going to turn on my motion blur because it's going to look really cool when it speeds up. And I'm going to turn on the other eyeball and click away from my graph editor. And now what I've done is I actually, with only 2 keyframes, done the same thing I tried to accomplish with 4. Here we go. Watch that motion blur. Pretty cool stuff. So I hit my space bar to preview that, and it's kind of running through the animation for me, which I really dig. And that's the basics of setting keyframes in After Effects. Now, a piece of advice I would give you is once you set your keyframe, you can move your keyframes, you can like, so that if you want the animation to start a little later, you can totally do that. You can change, like I said, your composition settings and your time. But one thing you want to avoid is if you hit the stopwatch again, it will delete your keyframes. It will no longer have them. So I know your inclination for a stopwatch is start and stop. If you're animating, you kind of always want it to be started. So keep that in mind as you go forward. And those are basic keyframes. So right now we have kind of this animation of the ball, which is really nice. Now, what else can we do here? Well, let's go ahead and let's create a new composition in the same kind of file. We're going to create a new composition, and we're going to call this rocket scene. And we're going to do stuff a little bit differently here. Firstly, I need a little more. I need like 8 seconds. So I'm going to go ahead and make that 8 seconds. And my rocket scene is now empty. My ball is up here. And at this point, if you want to like organize your scenes, you can be like, this is scene 1. Make a little folder, drop things in, right? And then we can make another little folder and call it scene 2. Drop that rocket ship scene. Now the composition and the assets look totally different, right? The compositions, or the stages, have this little film strip. The assets show up as this little piece of paper. All right, now that we're in the rocket scene, what we can do, and we're on our composition, what we can do is add some assets. So let's double click, and I have a moon, I have a sky, and I have a spaceship. And one of the things I'm going to do differently here is I want to import these. I want to kind of, I'm going to eventually make them into compositions. So I'm going to pull them in. I'm going to hit import. So they're just regular assets. I'm going to make sure they're in their appropriate folder, which is fine. I have those files. And now I want to make a composition with each. So actually, I think for this one, we're going to just keep the spaceship as a composition. So to create a comp with a spaceship that is 1228 by 1274, I'm going to drag it to the little film strip at the bottom and let go. Now there's a reason I'm doing this. I'm actually going to scale this down just a little bit. And I'll explain that in a few seconds. But let's go back to our rocket scene. Let's go ahead and let's throw the sky in there. Now the sky, I picked a kind of a skinny image. So let's see, Control D. Let's see if this is seamless. Not the greatest, right? Maybe if we switch it, it will look a little better. Yeah, that looks a little better. Okay, I can deal with that. Now these are on different layers, right? And that could get a little cumbersome. So I'm going to highlight both layers, and I'm going to go to Layer, Pre-Compose. Pre-Compose is just going to put these in a folder or a composition. So if I hit Pre-Compose, and I call this background stuff, and I say move all this stuff into this new folder or composition, boom. It puts it in its own composition. If I double click, by the way, they're all editable. I can go in. I have little tabs now that I can kind of go back and forth, but now they're all on the same layer, which I absolutely love. So now that I have that, I'm looking to put my my moon in here. So my moon's going to be huge, but that's okay. He's a little angry. And I'm going to make this moon like 15%. Just put him up here. Cool. All right. We're going to play with this moon in a later lesson. I just kind of want to set the stage for you all. Now that I have my rocket ship, I can go ahead and add my spaceship into the scene. But now, mind you, I'm putting the composition in, not just the spaceship PNG, but the whole folder inside. All right. This spaceship is a little too big for me. He's going to fly into the moon's eye. So I'm going to shrink it a little bit. And I'm going to start my animation from the bottom. So let's set some position keyframes on the spaceship composition. And, maybe we'll get it a little bit smaller. All right. So I'm going to hit P for position. And you can lock these layers, by the way, if you're afraid you're going to move them. You can even solo a layer if you just want to see that specific layer. I'm going to set my keyframe for position. I think by the end of the 8 seconds, it's going behind the moon, so we're going to play with that in a second, but it's going to get to the moon. So if it's going behind the moon, easy as that. Let's unlock that layer and drag it underneath, lock it, and now it's hitting the player in the eye. So now we have a not animated, it's keyframed, but it's like really poor spacing. We have kind of a rocket ship that's flying to the moon. Boom. So if we want to play with that spacing of the position, we can obviously go to our graph editor, highlight position. When we separate our values now, we're not going to delete anything because we have unique values for each one. And I'm going to play with some of the default curves here. So I'm going to just grab the default curves and get a little scoop there. An arc is a principle of animation. That's why I'm doing that. Boom. And let's go ahead and add another. And this is 8 seconds, so you'll kind of notice that you're not going to see such a drastic shift in time, or excuse me, in spacing, but it definitely is going to do that. Notice it is also coming from the anchor point. That's something to keep in mind. I'm going to get out of the graph editor. I'm going to watch it. And so there it goes. Pretty good. Now, let's say I want to speed that up a little bit. I could simply move my keyframe, and that works just fine. Check that out. So now it's going to get there a little faster. Cool. Now, if I want it to accelerate in the middle, I can simply, because both have the stopwatch selected, I can simply speed that up a little. And you'll notice your curve gets a little wonky here. Look at your graph editor to kind of help solve that. So if you have a kink in the graph editor, it most likely, and you can see there's like a little hump right here. I bet you that's where that little kink in the armor is. Yep, there it is. Boom. So watch it again here. So it speeds up a little bit in the middle, slows back down, and hits our curve. So this is a really good way to animate. Now, let's go back to why we put this spaceship in a composition. If I double click this, the spaceship's just kind of hanging out. There's no animation currently on this layer. But if I want this to shake or wiggle, it's way easier, or if I want to change the color back and forth, it's way easier to do that on a still spaceship than it is on a spaceship going back and forth, right? If I had to wiggle this, oh my gosh, think of all the keyframes it's going to go. So I'm going to go to my spaceship, and I'm going to hit P for position, and I'm going to hit a keyframe. And to set the same keyframe, I can either hit Control-C, Control-V for copy and paste, or I can just hit this little diamond over here. And I'm going to highlight those two keyframes, and I'm going to use one of my favorite tools in After Effects. So I'm going to go to Window, Wiggler. And the Wiggler is pretty neat. The Wiggler will actually wiggle two keyframes in between them. So if I just kind of up the frequency and magnitude, I put it to jagged, and I hit Apply, it sets all these keyframes. So now it's like shaking, right? But the cool part is because I have this in its own little folder, it's still going to reference this here. So watch this. See how it's kind of shaking now? That's why we use compositions. And it's a really clean way to animate. And it's a really, really easy way to kind of get your, put some motion blur on that, kind of get your animation to really stand out. So by either whether it's nesting background elements and like keeping them in their own little folder. So again, if we wanted to change both of those to a different color, I can simply unlock that, go to effects, go to that good old color correction again, hue and saturation, colorize, make it red. That's going to update the whole scene. Right? That's imperative, because if my client says, oh, I don't want that to be red, I want it to be purple or blue, then we can simply do that. And that is the basics of After Effects. We're going to dive into more of how to make like this scene way more dynamic in 3D. But to render this, the last step we need to do is actually save our file. So we're going to do a save as. I'm going to go ahead and put it in the folder I created on the desktop, and I'm going to call this P1. Cool. And After Effects is dependent on file space, so actually I didn't put that in there, but that's okay. So let's say I move the moon out of the folder I found it in. What you're going to notice is After Effects immediately says, hey, that moon doesn't exist anymore, and it's most likely not going to render that specific moon. And you can actually see right now it's built off of cache, like cookies, but right now here you can see the moon is gone. So to get that moon back, I would actually have to say right click and I would have to say replace footage with a file, and I would need to go find where I put that moon and hit import, and then it will replace it for me. But for our sake, every time we save a file, we're going to actually go to the File Dependencies folder. We're going to then go to Collect Files, and it says, do we want to save it? Sure. It's going to ask us, like, okay, where do you want to put this stuff? I can add comments. I can say, this is property of me. Great. And then I can hit collect. Now what that's going to do is ask you, do you want to make a folder? And I do. I want to make this the rocket ship animation folder. And what that does is create a folder on your desktop called Rocket Ship Animation. It has all of your different folders you created with a copy of all your different scenes. So at this point, if you want to go ahead and zip this file or put this file, the Rocket Ship folder, if you want to put that into your Google Drive, everything will link back up when you're done. So if you go to open this on another computer or share this with another person, it will be good to go for you. So that's really the only file you need. Now that's saving your file. If we want to render this scene, we can simply go to our render settings, which is composition. So right now we're going to only render the rocket scene, and we're going to go to add to Adobe Media Encoder Q. Now Media Encoder is basically an external piece of software that Adobe developed for multiple programs across the Creative Cloud to export animations, videos, you name it. And Media Encoder sometimes takes a little bit of time to boot up. So I always say, and we saw this with Animate as well, I always say give it a minute or two. You can see it's loading up here for sure. And by default, sometimes your file won't show up immediately. So you see how my file is not here? That makes, it still to this day will make me panic. It'll make me go, wait, where's my file? But if you sure enough, if you wait it out, that file is going to pop up there. So we're going to give it a few seconds here. But again, this is just the basics of After Effects. The idea is you can do a lot of hand-drawn animation in Animate. You can bring it into After Effects, do some really dynamic backgrounds. There's our rocket scene. We want to go ahead and make sure this goes into a folder like our desktop where we can find it. I like MP4s. They're really easy. So H.264, it comes to an MP4 file. And when you're ready to go, you just simply highlight that scene and hit play. And this is going to go and render it and create that file that you can then upload to YouTube and then put that YouTube clip into a class folder or an assignment. And it relatively is quick, but things like pixels, right? So if you have like 300 DPI files, and if you have tons of like your Photoshop file, for instance, is like a gig large, well, that's gonna kind of take some time away from this. So just be aware of that when you're building. But when we're done, we have that moon floating around there. We have a file that's rocket scene. So if we double click, there's our file. We made our animation. It's all good, and we're good to go. So in the next couple lessons, we're going to learn how to import your Photoshop and your Illustrator files and in layers and everything to be animated inside of After Effects. We're going to also learn how to do 3D layers, so deal with some like multi-plane cameras and space and utilize cameras inside of After Effects to give the illusion of depth in your scene. And we're going to continue to build that up to, again, ultimately help you create a really dynamic animation to kind of display that creativity that you all have. All right, that's all I got for today. I will talk to you guys next time. Have a good one.